Thank you, Corey, and thank you and the team at Will for inviting me to be here. It's truly an honor to be speaking to school leaders who have such an influence on what happens in our children's lives and in their learning, so I'm honored to be here. When my husband and I first started our family, we lived in a very old home. It was built in 1929. And if anyone knows old homes, they know that they have a lot of charm, but they're kind of a pain when it comes to home improvement projects. And so when we had a broken light fixture, that was no exception. And I said to my husband, I'm gonna call an electrician, right? That's sensible. Well, he had broad shoulders and his chest puffed out, and he said, absolutely not. I can do this. I can fix this. I can handle it. And I said, well, okay, but historically, there have been many F-bombs dropped during these projects, and you end up needing to hire someone anyway. So he said, no, I'm going to do it. I said, okay, but you only get 3 curse words because the children are getting older, and I don't want them hearing this. He agreed. Well, I happened to not be home during this project, and when I came home, my son, who was 7 at the time, runs up to me, and he says, Mom, Dad almost started a fire, and now we don't have any power. Yep, sounds about right. So I call an electrician. He comes, he laughs at the whole situation. He fixes it within an hour, charges us $60, no big deal. And by the time he left, he had nicknamed my husband Sparky. Sometimes we have to let the experts do what the experts do. And while we want to think that we can do things that we don't know how to do and we can learn new things, that is so true for so many things, but sometimes we have to be able to say, I don't know what to do. And so as I'm speaking to you today about ed tech and how it's affecting our children's learning, I want you to think about what you're good at as school leaders. What are you the experts of? And I don't know your work as much as you do, but as I was thinking about asking you that question, I thought, well, you're good at making decisions. You're good at critically thinking. And you're good at making difficult decisions, owning it, and being able to communicate that effectively to your teams and to your teachers and even to families in your districts. My colleague, Emily Churkin, has dubbed this phrase, and I think it's quite brilliant. Ed tech is just big tech in a sweater vest. So what we're learning now that we've had ed tech in schools for at least a decade is that schools have been sold a lie about what it was supposed to do for our kids. We were told that kids need this to learn for the future. Tech is going to be in their lives. They need to know how to use it, and it's up to us to teach them how to use it. Now that is actually quite true, and we're going to get into the ways in which I think it's necessary and important to use technology in education. But that's not what we're finding. We're finding that there is a real struggle in our kids, and it's not really going the way we thought it was going to go. This is a snapshot of my daughter's grades. She's in 6th grade. She goes to a K through 8 Catholic school. And this was in October, mid-October. She started the school year the day after Labor Day, so this was about 6 weeks in. Now, I circled her science grade at a C, and the rest of her grades are A's. She has always been a straight A student. I have never once checked her grades on the online system. I only wait for, the report cards, and even then, I know how she's doing because her school doesn't use a ton of ed tech. She's still doing worksheets. She gets everything back. When she takes a test, we get it back. We know how she did. Well, she came to me in mid-October, just before conferences, and she said, Mom, can we check my grades? And I said, sure, but why? You've never asked that before. And she said, well, Miss Moore, her science teacher, is using a lot on the computer. We're taking tests on the computer. All of our assignments are online, and I'm not getting anything back. I don't know how I'm doing. And she had a sense that she wasn't doing well. So we go to check her grades, and here it is. She's getting a C. And so I start talking to her about, okay, well, what's happening? Why is she using the computer so much? And she said she didn't know, but that all of the kids in her class actually were struggling. They were feeling like they weren't doing well on the tests because they weren't taking tests on the paper with pencil. They were using the computer. And so they happened to actually all ask her, hey, can we go back to paper tests? So she had agreed, and she started printing out the tests. And the kids were liking that better. But at this point, everything was on the computer. So by the end of the card marking, so this was a couple weeks later, her grade ended with a C in her school. 80% is a C. And so she was getting A's in every other class except for science. And so what ended up happening was I spoke to the teacher at conferences. I explained to her many of the things I'm going to explain to you today. And what she had said was that she was new to the school this year. In her previous school, she would email the kids their grades and their results, and so they would have a better idea of how they were doing, but in this school, there was no email. And I kind of thought, well, I don't think that's really the point. That's one of the issues, right? But a bigger issue is that here you have a straight A student who's getting 1 C, and she specifically knows why, and she's communicating that. So if you've ever thought about what big tech calls us, I think it's really an interesting term. They call us users. And I know we all have used that word for ourselves, and I don't know how many of you have actually thought about that, but calling somebody a user is like calling them an addict, right? Like that's the other way that we use that term. And so if you think about what tech is, it's not a product, it's not a service. So what are they selling? They're selling us. And if we apply that to ed tech, they're selling our students information. And now we have this issue of privacy. There's no parental consent. No one has ever asked me as a parent or any parent I've known to consent to these tech companies collecting our children's names, emails, birth dates, all of their information, and frankly, selling it. And that's the business of what technology is. And so we do have to be concerned about privacy for our kids when we introduce these products. So I was a therapist for kids for about 20 years. And as you heard, I made a change because I think that the adults need a lot of help today. Technology came on the scene, and it completely changed childhood. And child development didn't change, but our children's environments changed. And so when I was practicing, I started to see this very bizarre trend of kids who came to me with severe mental health issues. I'm talking self-harm, eating disordered. Many of them were coming out of the hospital after their first suicide attempt. And in my training, I was taught that if a kid is struggling, it's likely because of their environment. Likely they've had some trauma, some abuse, neglect. There's some kind of, something I could attach it to from a psychosocial perspective. But that wasn't the case with these families. Most of these families were intact. The parents were loving and supportive. They wanted to help. They wanted to know what they could do to help their child. They were showing up in the therapy. And I thought, wow, what's happening? This was around 2014, 2015, and in my community, they had, during this time, started to allow middle schoolers to have their smart devices during the day. I saw a direct correlation in my practice to mental health decline because of more opportunity to be on that phone. And so I thought, well, I need to talk about this. I don't think there's enough conversation around it. Mind you, 2014, 2015, fast forward 11, 12 years later, there's a lot of conversation around it, thank goodness. And so I started talking in my community, and people were like, yeah, that's a problem, you're right, yeah. But nobody really wanted to do anything about it. And so years later, we're going to the lockdowns, and more kids on more devices for longer. And I actually, because had switched to Zoom, I had seen more of a, up close and personal image of their family life and their dynamics and what was going on in the home. And what I came to realize is that, the tech is a problem, but it's actually not the problem. It's a symptom. And the problem is ultimately parents who don't feel that they have any power. Parents who want to keep their kids comfortable, who don't know how to be uncomfortable in themselves to challenge their kids to be uncomfortable. And so we've given tech as a way to make things convenient and easy and check out and not have to experience pain. And so I thought, well, the kids are the canaries in the coal mine. They're telling us something with their behavior, with their mental health issues. And rather than diagnose them and treat them and scapegoat them and make them the problem, I want to help the adults, anyone interfacing with kids, parents, teachers, educators, school leaders like yourselves, to understand just what's happening to their development and why we're seeing what we're seeing. So I'm sure you've heard this. This is kind of the age-old marketing ploy. Get kids hooked on your products young so you have lifetime users. And what we're being told is that introducing technology early and often is necessary for our kids. But what's actually true is that it's affecting so much of how they grow and develop and learn. One of the things that's important for you to know from an educational standpoint is that the gray matter and the white matter in their brains are not developing. There's research that actually shows this now. Gray matter and white matter are responsible for many things: cognition, memory, sensory processing, and self-regulation. So now we have this issue in schools where kids are melting down, they're having behavioral issues, they're having to leave class, they can't sit still, they're having memory and attention issues, and they're flooding the teacher's time on classroom management and social emotional learning and mental health, and there's this bigger conversation around what is happening to the kids. And we're losing a lot of good teachers because they don't know how to manage this, right? They're not trained to do this. And they also, I think, feel like this has all been put on them and they don't have any power or control over it. And so what we need to understand is that when the kids are in front of a device, so it's great that now we have this national conversation around getting the smart devices out of the schools. I don't think that's much of an argument anymore. And I think many states have passed legislation or are working on passing legislation for that. But it's one thing to get rid of the smart devices. It's another to acknowledge that if they're in front of a Chromebook or an iPad, whether that's school issued or because they had to bring it themselves for bring your own device policy, then what's happening is a lot of their brain development isn't moving forward. And they're not moving. So we want to be concerned about what they're doing on the device, but we also want to be equally concerned with what they're not doing because they're on the device. So big tech has hijacked our children's attention and focus. One of the things that we need to understand about what this is doing to brains is that when our attention is focused in a device, it completely changes how we process information. So we process images 60,000 times faster than text. And if you're on any kind of internet, whether it's even just if it's text, if it's reading something, there's going to be graphics. There's going to be lights, blue light, there's stimulation, there's ads. The ads even play on mute, so you see something moving. And so just that alone makes the brain go faster. And we don't want the brain to go faster for children when we're trying to teach them and we're trying to help them develop. In preparation for this, I spoke to quite a few special education leaders. And they told me that what they're seeing is that a lot of kids are flooding into the special ed system that don't need to be there. And one of the major things they're seeing, and I'm not going to call it ADHD, I'm going to call it executive functioning issues. They're seeing kids who are struggling just to remember to turn in assignments. I don't know if that's something, if you have kids or around kids you've heard of, but this is so common. And even when I was practicing and seeing kids, if I had a nickel for every time I had a kid and their mother in my office fighting about their grades and not turning things in, I would be rich. The conversation would always go like this. Well, you did the assignment. Why did you not turn it in? And inevitably, the kid slunched over with their head down, would say, I forgot. So the lack of executive functioning, even just to remember to turn in your assignment, you did the work, and they're not getting credit because they're not turning it in, is so pervasive. And the other thing I noticed is that middle schoolers typically get planners. In some schools, they don't anymore because they're using Google Classroom. But if they do get a planner, they're still using Google Classroom. And Google Classroom has all the assignments there, and the teachers expect the kids to be checking that on a regular basis. And in fact, many of the teachers will add assignments to the Google Classroom after the school day ends. So the kids are encouraged to constantly be checking that rather than their planner. So what I hear from a lot of kids is, oh, well, I lost my planner. Well, yeah, you did, because you're not using it on a regular basis. And they get the planners in middle school because that is a great time to start teaching them organization and responsibility. And no one's going to hold your hand anymore to remind you to turn that assignment in. And here's a system for you to be able to do that. And that's a good skill, right? If you think about yourselves as adults, we all need systems to make sure that we're on time and functioning and ready for our day and ready for the task at hand. So this isn't all anecdotal. I know I've told you lots of stories so far. There is research, thanks to Jared Horvath, and he is a former teacher turned neuroscientist. And he found something quite alarming, that when students in general, take exams, when they switch from paper and pen or pencil to taking exams online, it drops their test scores. So the SAT switched from being a paper test in 2024 to being an online test. But we didn't see SAT scores dropping because they changed the test. Prior to 2024, there were 5 passages of 750 words, so they were rather long. And then the student would have to answer 10 questions based on those 750 words. The 10 questions were analytical. It wasn't just comprehension. So you had to demonstrate that you really knew what you read. After 2024, so currently, there are 54 passages at 75 words. So they're quick and they're a lot easier to get through. And there's only one question. And that one question is a comprehension question. It's very easy. So if you read the 75 words, you're likely to get that question correct. We've been seeing test scores drop internationally since 2012. And, there is a correlation, of course. We don't quite have causation yet, but I think that with the neuroscience information we have now, we can come to some pretty good conclusions about what even just shifting from paper to computer for testing can do. And again, I experienced that with my own child. So if you're spending any kind of money, which I'm sure you are, on firewalls in your district, I would encourage you to look at that because essentially the kids are smarter than we are. They know how to work around all of the firewalls. And when I was seeing them in therapy, they would tell me how. I would not quite understand it because I don't know how to get around firewalls, but they certainly do. And what they're doing on their devices is not what you think they're doing because they're getting around all the blocks to the sites they want to be on. There are major reports all across the country of kids as young as 9 being exposed to pornography during the school day, under the noses of their teachers. There is no way a teacher can manage that. They are being advertised to, and ads are not subject to age requirements. So there's a story of a 7-year-old who was on a pretty popular educational app called Geometry Dash, and it was on a school-issued iPad, so I'm sure it was, a lot of things were blocked, but this particular ad was not blocked. And the ad was for an AI girlfriend, and it was a nude woman. So kids aren't just being exposed to inappropriate content, they're also entertaining themselves during the school day. They're watching movies, they're gaming, they're, extremely distracted. I don't think it's a reasonable expectation to expect a kid to be any match for big tech. Big tech has designed their products to be addictive. Their algorithms are designed to keep us on whatever tool we're on for as long as possible. It doesn't matter if it's educational or not. You think about something like IXL, if you know what that is, it's a math learning tool. And when you answer a question right, there's a celebration. It says awesome, and there's, birthday hats and, big bursts of dopamine because that feels good, right? Well, of course, any kid, even if it's educational, if they get an answer right and they get that kind of a celebration, they're gonna wanna keep going. Now, in terms of learning, okay, that's good. Do we want kids to be excited about math? Sure, I'm still traumatized from math when I was a student. But we don't want them to be excited about math because of an algorithm. We want them to be excited from a human perspective. So teachers, historically, I know, have always tried to make math fun, right? Because it's not fun. So they've made games and flashcards and competitions and things like that, and that is how kids learn, and that's how you get them excited and motivated. The algorithm is keeping them addicted. So we have heard this, kids will be behind, it's the way of the future, we have to do this, it's irresponsible not to. And there is some truth to this because we want to make sure that they're tech literate, okay? What does that mean? How many kids do you know who are on a device all day who don't know how to type? They're hunting and pecking. My kids too, and I've taught them how to type. And I've been insistent that they type the right way, but they wanted to hunt and peck because that was easier. And so they taught themselves how to hunt and peck quickly. And so if we're going to be having kids on devices and using technology in the schools, we want to be intentional about it. We want to make sure that they're getting the skills that they need for life. So I talk a lot about child development because this is an important thing to understand when we're talking about when to introduce tech tools and how to introduce them. And child development works like the rungs of a ladder. Each stage builds on the one before it. Now, nothing's going to be perfect in development, so there will be some little bit of crack in some of those steps. No big deal, kids are resilient, they can survive that. What I noticed about today's kids and why I made this change is that they're not just having little cracks in those rungs of the ladder. The rungs of the ladder are broken. And so what's happening is we expect them to mature at the correct age they are, but that's not happening. And because it's not happening, what we're doing is saying there's something wrong with the child. We're diagnosing them. We're telling the parents that they need to be tested or put on medication. And frankly, what it is a lack of getting what they need in their development. So I developed a framework to help you understand how children develop and what they need and when they need it. It starts with movement, as young as infancy. So those primitive reflexes are necessary for the brain to grow. Because every time a child moves, it scaffolds their brain for growth. So let's go back to what we were talking about in terms of giving kids devices. When they're on the device, it means they're not moving. Even their fine motor skills in their hands aren't being used because they're not writing and drawing and cutting and painting and getting textile with different textures. And we're seeing a lot of sensory processing disorders because of that lack of movement. So when the brain can grow the way that it needs to, then the child can move into psychosocial development, which many of you probably already know a thing or two about. If you are educators, you would have taken some child development classes in your education. And so what we're seeing is that kids aren't maturing in that social emotional development because they're not getting what they need from the very beginning. And then the last phase that I call the connection to self is 3 critical periods of time in childhood when kids get independent, or they start to want to separate more from their parents. And again, if we're giving them convenience over resilience and working through hard things and having to learn how to trust themselves and challenge themselves, and we're giving them ease by just pressing buttons and getting a bunch of dopamine, cheap dopamine, then they're not growing in their independence. So that movement is important for what's called sensory motor integration. That is 3 things. The eyes working together to process visual information to the brain, the ears working together to process auditory information to the brain, and the body physically being able to cross over from left to right, which is the midline of the body. And all of that happens through not distracting childhood. Children should be outside, running, jumping, climbing trees, getting their hands in the mud, and that is what helps them cross the midline of their body. When we think about reading, there are forms of education. Actually, the Waldorf model does not teach reading until 7 years old, because what they do first is train the eye to track from left to right. So reading class in a Waldorf school before 7 is exercising the eyes and having the kids track from left to right and practicing that and gaining that skill, because Rudolf Steiner understood that both eyes have to work together to process that information. But if we're putting them on a device, even to read, so now I know I've heard this time and time again, kindergartners should use iPads to read because they're going to have to learn how to use them anyway. That is the worst thing you can do for a kindergartner. If you're wanting a kindergartner to read, their bodies literally need to be ready for that. And the way that they develop is through movement and play. And same with the ears. So if they're not hearing voices, if they're not interacting in human life, and they have those earbuds on them, how many times have you seen those little kids with their heads in their iPads, with those protective cases, with the bright colors and their bright earphones, and they're literally shutting out the world, and that is preventing from that auditory processing. So the brain develops in 4 different phases. This is Piaget, if anyone recalls that. I like the old school theorists. And from 0 to 2 years old, they are in the sensory phase. So they understand the world through action and pictures and images. And so, again, what they need is for their caregivers to be looking them in the eye to develop that brain and that processing. And then from 2 to 7, they understand the world through language and mental images. So this is a great time to be reading to them and reading books so they can follow along. They can look at the pictures. They can even look at the text. And if you do that, then they gain that growth. And of course, from 7 to 12, they understand through logic, and this is when they can start to learn more sophisticated things, and the expectations become higher on them in school. And what we're seeing is a lot of kids not be ready for those higher expectations. So just like I was saying about kind of not holding their hand so much, 3rd grade, 4th grade is usually when that starts, kind of getting them to be more responsible for themselves. And we're seeing kids who are really struggling with that. And lastly, kids start to become, after 12, more into scientific reasoning. And remember, if they have all of this as a basis, then they can get to those more difficult concepts in their brain after 12. So social emotional development is next. And that is from 0 all the way to 25, and this is based on Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. And from 0 to 18 months, we have attachment. Again, looking into the caregiver's eyes, having their needs met, that cues the nervous system for safety. And from 18 months to 3 is will and authority. So that's like the terrible twos, right? The I will not and do it by myself. And this is a great time to be letting them do it by themselves. And the reason for that is because they need to get to the other side of frustration. Many kids today are struggling so much with that frustration tolerance. If something's hard, they give up, they melt down, they don't trust themselves, they don't feel capable. So for example, 3-year-olds should really be like learning how to tie their shoes and zip up their coats. And I have a funny story about that. When my son was 5, I was pregnant with his sister. And I had done the thing of like, only child, I can do things for him. I totally enabled him. And I started to panic. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have a baby and this kid doesn't know how to tie his shoes. So I started to implement some of these like independent things, right? Like tie your shoes, take a shower by yourself from start to finish. Well, he did not want to tie his shoes. So he's a master negotiator. And so I said, okay, I'll make you a deal. If you learn how to tie your shoes, you can have the Velcro shoes. I'll buy them for you. But it's very important that you have that skill. He agreed. Well, one day he was with my dad, and Grandpa says yes to everything. And he saw that as an opportunity to ask Grandpa to buy him a pair of Velcro shoes. And of course, Grandpa does, and so he comes home, and he's all proud of himself. I don't know how he thought that I would allow this, but he's like, yeah, Mom, I got Velcro shoes. And I'm like, no, you didn't. We're going back to the store and returning them. And he eventually did learn how to tie his shoes, but he was very frustrated during that whole time. And so I realized that the younger the child is, when you introduce these concepts, the better, because they want it. This is the autonomy and independence phase from 3 to 5. They want to do things by themselves, and they want you as the parent or the educator or anyone interfacing with kids to trust them, to tell them, yes, you can, you are capable, I believe in you. Another story about Oliver. When he was 2, my brother came over with a gift. It was one of those Pottery Barn chairs with his name engraved on it. He was so excited. It was blue. It was the coolest thing ever. Well, my brother likes to challenge people. So he decides to sit in Oliver's chair. And of course, Oliver starts to get upset, right? He's 2. And I'm looking at my brother like, are you kidding me right now, dude? Like, you don't have kids. This is my first kid. What are you trying to do? And he just kind of looked at me like, just wait. So he looks at Oliver and he says, Oliver, give me one reason why I should get out of this chair. And something interesting happened. Oliver started to calm. And he started to think. And what he came up with was quite brilliant. He said, Uncle Mike, you would be much more comfortable on the couch. 40% of 2-year-olds own their own iPads. Oliver had to do a lot in that moment. He had to have self-control. He had to use critical thinking. And he had to be able to effectively communicate with an adult. That's a lot for a 2-year-old. And my brother, not even me, my brother knew better. He knew that he was capable of that. And I don't think we see our young kids or kids at any age capable of those things. And so what's happening is we're introducing these devices way too early before they could develop all those necessary skills. From 5 to 12 is confidence building. So if the child has attached, if they've been able to say what their boundaries are and respect other people's boundaries in the will and authority stage, if they have that independence and autonomy, then they can build that sense of confidence. And we get this wrong in our culture. We think confidence comes from winning awards or getting the trophy or getting the accolade. And that's great. Those are all bonuses. Those are a necessary part of why we do hard things. But that's not how confidence is built. Confidence is built from getting to the other side of a challenge, from setting goals and working on the goal, even though we fail and even though we fall down, and getting back up and saying, I can do this, and getting to the other side of it. And then from 12 to 18, if they've got that confidence, they can start to identify who they are, their character traits, their likes and dislikes. We have a lot of identity issues in our kids today. They don't know who they are naturally because early on in those middle school years, that's just going to be shaky. It's like a toddler learning how to walk. But now we have that added issue for our kids of influencers online and groups online who tell them that there's certain things even when they're not. And so what we really want to be doing is helping them develop this without distraction. And part of doing that is not putting a device in front of them. And then when they get to be 18 to 25, they can be solid in who they are. And we're seeing now our Gen Zers who are in that age range, they're not solid and they're struggling. So I wanted to bring AI into the conversation because we're not just talking about ed tech anymore, we're talking about AI tools. And I think that it's important to be asking how we're using them. So there's generative AI, which is, the AI most of us hear about, right? It's the Chat GPT, it's the, you type something in and it spits something out to you. Well, I'm sure that you can imagine that even just the little bit of development I talked about, how that's affecting our kids. It's affecting those critical thinking skills that we want them to be developing that are not going to be fully developed until they're 25. Because 90% of brain development happens before you're 6, and the 10% doesn't happen until you're 25. And that 10% is executive functioning. It's memory, it's reasoning, it's critical thinking, it's judgment, it's self-control and self-regulation. All the things that our kids are struggling with. So one of the special education leaders I talked to told me the story of how her district is using some AI tools, and I thought it was awesome how they were using it. And so there's definitely a place for AI in our education, but we really want to be intentional about it. And how they were using it in special education was they had this early on student, I believe she was 3, and she was nonverbal, and her mother was Spanish speaking. So the teacher who comes and trains the mom on this tool that they have for the girl to be able to communicate didn't speak Spanish. So they used an AI tool to help translate for each other so they could communicate. So there was an earbud in the mom's ear and an earbud in the teacher's ear, and the teacher spoke English, but then the earbud in the mom's ear spoke Spanish to the mom. So then the mom could learn how to use this tool to help her nonverbal child communicate. And I thought that was quite brilliant. And so again, I want you to know that I'm not standing up here saying, I know you've invested a lot in technology in your districts and in your schools, and in no way am I saying that was a bad choice or that you have to get rid of everything. You have the infrastructure, and that's great. So let's now learn how to look at the tools that you're using and see, is it affecting learning and development and all the ways that kids need to build those rungs of the ladder? Or is it something that actually is enhancing learning and actually helping people? And one of the dangers that's happening from AI is that kids are attaching to their generative AI tools like ChatGPT, and they're using it as a companion or a therapist. There was a case of a kid, 16, his name was Adam Rain, and he was using ChatGPT just for school, for homework, to whatever, assist him, which most of our kids are doing. And he found himself getting more friendly with Chat and talking to it about his feelings and his suicidal ideation. Now, Chat is trained to, if you express suicidal ideation, it's trained to give you like resources. So immediately it'll spit out like the 988 number, which is the emergency for suicide, and it'll give you all kinds of resources and tools. But the kids know how to circumvent that. And there are prompts that you can put in there to get around the fact that they're not going to engage. And so Chat ended up engaging with Adam about his suicidal thoughts and validated them. At one point, Adam said to Chat, I want to leave a noose within sight of my parents so that they know how I feel and they help me. And Chat told him not to do it. He ended up hanging himself, and he died. So we really have to understand that AI is a powerful tool. And while it can help us, in fact, I used it to build this presentation and to build the end of the presentation that you'll see soon. And if I didn't have Chat, I wouldn't have been able to do it, or I would have had to spend a lot of money to hire someone to do it for me. They're powerful tools and they could be useful. But when we put it in the hands of a developing brain, before they understand what's happening, and before they understand that there's an algorithm, and there's even AI wants you on it for as long as possible, then we're really doing damage, and it's quite harmful. The other thing going on is kids are creating deep fakes, with a face and a nude body. It's ruining kids' lives. It's making them suicidal. It's not even them, but how do you prove it's not you? There's all kinds of issues that we didn't think about intentionally before we just handed it over. So what can you do? As education leaders, you have a lot of power. And I will tell you, I was really excited to be here today because to be able to speak in a room full of people who can make change, it's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So we have to reframe it from educational technology to technology education, right? So I mentioned a little bit ago typing. That's something that we could be using our tech for. One of the other things that I think we need to look at is having tech be isolated into a class, not having tech be infiltrated to every single class. I don't know that there's any purpose to tech being in an English or a literature class. We have to be able to get back to books and paper and writing because pen to paper stimulates the brain. And so if we had an isolated computer class or multiple classes, then we could teach kids how to use things like PowerPoint. Or, here's a great example. I was telling Corey this before. My daughter one day saw me working and saw 20 tabs open on my computer. I'm sure many of you have that too, right? And it's overwhelming. And I often wished I had 2 monitors or something because all these tabs were getting a little insane. And so she comes up to me and she goes, Mom, I can help you organize those tabs. And so I said, really? You can? And she's like, yeah. And so she showed me, and now I have all these beautiful color-coded tabs that are in groups. So all my tabs are organized in groups, and it's so less overwhelming. And she taught me that. So there are so many things our kids can learn that can be useful for the world, right? It took me, when I started doing this and doing online marketing and doing presentations, it took me a year to learn Canva and, different kinds of tools that help me to run my business. If we taught kids that stuff in school, they would be powerhouses. So you have this in your packets. This is a framework to help you ask yourselves and your districts those questions of, is technology aligned with student learning and development? And if tech wasn't such a big part of schools, I happen to think we wouldn't need a larger conversation about social emotional learning or mental health, because the mental health, remember, the decline is really associated with that lack of development. So the parents are going to be on board with this. I can't tell you how many parents I've heard from that say, this isn't good for my kids, this isn't working, how do I opt out, how do I get out of this, how do I go to my school board and tell them? I know that there's often this conversation around parents and educators being at odds. The parents are on board, the parents want this, and I think if you went back to your districts and had this conversation, you would have parents who were really interested in making change and probably even help with it. Technology is here to stay, but so are you. And I think us as the adults, as people who were the last ones to experience childhood the way that it was, I think it's our obligation, it's our job to impart protecting childhood and allowing our kids to grow and develop just the way that we were allowed to. And it can't end with us. We have so much more power than we think we do. And so I wanted to give you this tool. You can scan this QR code. It's an assessment, and it's based on that framework that you have. So there's 6 sections, just like on the framework, that are going to ask you a series of questions about how your district is doing on technology alignment. And it will tell you what your score is and kind of explain it a little bit. And so I wanted to give you something tangible that you could take back to your districts and actually really evaluate this and feel like you have something to leave with.